Good day, welcome. This is your Daily Med with Lady V. Today our lesson is from Jonah chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. We will see where God asked Jonah this searching question. Jonah chapter 4, verse 4 and 5. It says, Then the Lord said, Do you think it is right for you to be angry? Jonah went out of the city to a place near the city on the east side. He made a shelter for himself and sat there in the shade, waiting to see what would happen to the city. So we know that Jonah finally went and he preached. The people repented. God offered them his pardon, showed them his mercy. Jonah was displeased, so the Lord pricked the prophet's conscience with the probing query. Is it right for you to be angry? We see where Jonah in verse 9 of the same chapter 4 justified it. He says, I am angry even unto death. So the Bible says Jonah passed through Nineveh. He sat on the east side of the city to see what would become of the city. He made sure he left the city because he was expecting some great form of judgment to come to it. So he made himself comfortable from a distance where he could see what was happening. In his heart, he was still open that even though these people repented, that God would still destroy the city with his own converts of 120,000 people. All he wanted, all he would only want to see. Let me see, as we would say, what is it that God is really going to do. So before we get to the end of this book of Jonah, is Jonah really angry with God himself? It's a question that comes to mind. When we go back all the way to chapter 1, Jonah only has 4 chapters. But when we look at what Jonah did and see the deliberate acts that Jonah did even from the onset, then it makes us wonder not only that he is afraid or terrified of the wickedness of the Assyrians, but in totally disobeying God, disregarding the command that he gave him, find himself in the belly of the whale, prayed, eventually went to preach, and at this stage he is still expecting, after the people had repented, that God would still destroy him. So when we look at some of the acts starting from chapter 1, we saw where he went away and he paid his fare. We saw him going down into the ship from the presence of the Lord, so he says. We saw him lying down and comfortable going to sleep. All these are deliberate acts. We saw him in chapter 1, verse 8 and 9, making confession. But we also know he ended up making a choice to obey God. But he also made a choice that he wanted to die instead. We see Jonah deliberately prayed in the fish's belly in chapter 2, verse 1 through 9. We also see him fainting. We see him remembering the Lord, calling upon him, knowing that salvation is of God in chapter 2, verse 7. He renewed his consecration after being rescued in chapter 2, verse 7 and 9. Yes, finally in chapter 3 and verse 3, deliberately he arose and went to Nineveh. We saw as he began to enter the city deliberately in Jonah chapter 3 and verse 4, only 1 day's journey. He didn't wait till he got to the entire city. He began to preach only when he was in the journey, one of the 3 days journey, saying after 40 days, if Nineveh didn't turn from their wickedness, then they would be destroyed. They will be overthrown. We see Nineveh receiving God's mercy, and Jonah become very displeased and hungry in chapter 4 and verse 1 for the mercy that they had received. In chapter 4 and verse 2, we see him deliberately again praying and begging God to die. We see in today's lesson in chapter 4 and verse 5 that he walked out through the city and he left. He sat on the east side of the city. All these are deliberate actions. He left out of the city, make himself comfortable at a spot probably where he can have a good view of the city, looking for some form of judgment, extraordinary stuff, destruction that would come to the city. He desired the city to be overthrown. He, as we say, sat where he had the good view. He placed his eyes upon it. And when nothing happened, he was terribly disappointed. Jonah wanted what he wanted. He wants to have it his own way. Nothing else should come to these people except judgment, destruction, disaster, death, as it were. So we can see from his actions that he disagreed with how God handled the situation. And because he disagreed with what God did by showing them mercy and granting them salvation instead of destruction, Jonah's anger continued unabated. It's a terrible thing to go to bed hungry, to wake up angry, but more than all, to be displeased with the decision of a sovereign God. The Bible tells us we are his people. We are the sheep of his pastors. We are not our own. Jonah did not realize he was bought with a price. He is a prophet of God. And what God says he should go to Nineveh and do, he did. Then all the rest of it is left in God's hands. The consequences, it is up to God. But Jonah disregarded what God wanted, and instead he become sulking outside the city because he believed God wronged him. He believed God did not do what he, Jonah, wanted God to do, and that is to overthrow the city. God bless you today. Thank you again for watching. Please like, please subscribe, please share, and don't forget to visit my YouTube channel, Daily Med, with